All right. So what was any good in December? Well, we've got 20 best albums of December per my own interests. And now I'll say up front, I definitely had to scrape to put this list together. There wasn't that much of note in December, and I think 20 albums is a stretch this year. It wasn't as much of a stretch last year, but it usually is. Most people don't want to put out their record in December, and I don't blame them because I've done it before and nobody cares. So I did my best to cover the stuff that is great. There is a lot of like very important records that came out in December, and I definitely held back on my list, my end of the year list, an extra week or two, and still missed a couple of the deadline for a couple of records that are coming out this next week at random times, which I just won't include because it's a little bit too late. There, I will say that there's a record from I think Costa Rican band Transgression, who are worth checking out, which just can't be included in this list because I barely heard it once. So there's always something else, another detail to pick out of the aether, but we can only do what we can do. So, of course, the album of the month turns out to be Miss Thurming's Meds Hamry, and it wasn't guaranteed to be the best, though. I will say that number two on this list really had me there. But I've listened to this album at least 30 times at this point, and I had listened to it at least 15 by the time I wrote this. And I like that Miss Thurming have uh, transformed uh, without losing where they were going before and then where they were before that. And I'll get more into that when I actually sit down and write a review and do all that. But the they're very upfront with their messaging on this record that this is the I know they don't say it in as cheesy of a way as I will, but that this is more of a traditional heavy metal influenced thing. The spirit, attitude, and confrontation of actual heavy metal is in this record, and that's a big claim from a black metal band who are known for kind of dissonant um, work and atmospheric work. And they actually do deliver it, and it actually is a very good album. This incredible Corthon esque spirit to this record that is um, tireless and experimental and a little bit all over the place, but in a way that kind of comes together as you finish listening to the record. They take a couple of noise detours here. There's some really interesting textures spacing the songs here, and no tangent outlasts the feeling for me. So, pretty exceptional record. You know, definitely worth discovering on your own. And what little period of hype that we did get right before it released actually seems to be enduring as I sit with the record more and more. It's a pretty great work, even if it kind of just popped up out of nowhere. Um, so number two, I enjoyed almost just as much as the first as number one. Hellish is the Dance of Four Elemental Serpents, and this is a very traditional extreme thrash metal record, which you could call um, somewhat progressive blackened thrash metal, uh, in the sense that it does resemble the traditions of extreme thrash metal while also bending them. And it's very succinct, full of energy. These guys are extremely talented, and the record sounds amazing. It's one of my favorite thrash metal records of the year. And I think that they've uh, really landed on a cool place with this record that I wasn't expecting. And part of it is because you know, because of the pandemic and whatever circumstances arose, their bassist and vocalist, um, the same guy, he left, and they brought in a new guy, and it turns out this guy is pretty amazing at what he does, and they show off what he can do throughout this whole record. And so if you picked up their last two 7-inch records, you kind of saw this transformation coming to some degree, but it really explodes here on this record, and I thought it was fantastic. I listened to this endless, just all month long. Um, Crick's Core, however you would say that, is a British solo project, usually with a some session musicians, and Zoetrope is a single 20 something minute song, which is particularly challenging for its dissonant and uh, I would say somewhat elaborate and maddeningly detailed death metal guitar work. It's a semi dissonant or fully, whatever you want to say, black death metal record with a orchestral element, which is deeply intertwined in the work. So it's a lot to take in. It's a big event, but it's a very impressive one, and one that I was happy to sit with since I liked Poison Palinopsia, the previous full length, so much. This was like getting just half the length of that record, but almost the same amount of detail and less motion between movements. They just kind of attack this record in an interesting way. And I like this direction. I think that I would like more of Poison Palinopsia overall, just because it was a little bit more memorable in some aspects. But I do think that what they've added here is quite finely detailed. It is very impressive, and I think the bombast that the orchestral arrangements add are very impressive. I think that it could be a really important next step for the group to have taken here. So um, really compelling. I think a lot of people just passed by it because it was a very demanding release, but definitely don't overlook it um, as something cursory or anything less than it is. It's a really impressive record. Uh, Hammers of Misfortune's latest album is a just a completely mad progressive thrash metal record, um, which it brings back one of their previous singers. It brings back the fellow from Slewfeg on a couple of guest spots, and um, so what did I say about this record before? I think that the the way they've treated the interplay between the organist slash keyboardist and the rhythm guitars is on the level of the best like late 80s thrash metal rhythm guitar duos and trade-offs and shredders and all that stuff. I think that this record is intense, it's over the top, it's completely avant-garde in terms of like what thrash metal has been as progressive thrash metal, and I think it will appeal to folks who appreciate the German side of progressive thrash metal in the late 80s and the sort of birth of more interesting progressive metal in the early 90s. So that means everything from Mekong Delta's Best to um, like Psychotic Waltz and Depressive Age and even, Blind Delusion, even. But this is it has the drummer from the former Vector drummer plays on this record, and so it is not an ancient sounding record in the sense that um, there is a throughway to the future on this record. They kind of open up to what more they could do. It's just that this is um, a completely intense wave that just hits 1,000 times throughout this record, and it's like nothing else. So like, yeah, it's a thing I'm excited about, but it's hard to necessarily come up with like a pitch, like a quick elevator pitch. Like, what is this? Well, it's a very well celebrated heavy metal band's complete 180 that just really works for me as a huge fan of all things thrash metal. So it's worth checking out. It's definitely a trip, and it is weird as fuck, but I think it'll get there with most people who just stick with it. Um, Ritual Death is what I consider their self-titled debut album. full length album, is like a proper black metal album where it's an aggressive occult kind of thing, which is physical in its guitar work, clever with its keyboard work, punkish in its affect, and is it professes to be nothing more than death worship. And I think that it's not only memorable and kind of wild to sit with on repeat, but it it does what it says it's going to do. And I think if you like Darvaza, early Gorgoroth, and that those sort of punkish but still thoughtful, aggressive. Well, even early Beharit is another one too, like the 93 and like kind of yeah 92, 93 Beharit, where it all happened. It also fits in here, so it is it's definitely a great record and worth checking out. Uh, Dead Meadow is a long-running psychedelic rock band, and this record is something different. If you're a big fan of them already, you would expect something closer to like the Brian Jonestown Massacre, or uh, basically '60s, late '60s, early '70s heavy psych revival that is a little bit more mellow, a little bit more prone to jam, and that's what you would know the band for. This album is something different. It's it doesn't sound like the Black Angels or something like that. This is a different, almost like cinematic experience. And I know that's kind of weird, but like to say, but each song is has its own vibe, and it's very chilled out. It's very stony, but there's a clever conversational value to each of the guitar threads that drive most of these instrumental, largely only instrumental pieces. Um, if you're just a fan of fuzz rock and a certain feeling, you'll get it, and it's worth getting here. Match the song title with the feeling of the song, and you'll get it. Uh, Rudra is a black and death metal band out of Singapore, and they're one of the earliest and probably only enduring Singaporean band in this style that I can think of. Besides, I could be wrong about Impiety. These guys started back in the early '90s. They were a death thrash metal group before they were like more of like a black thrash metal group with death metal influences. And their real signature didn't arrive for a couple of albums. Uh, it was probably the 2000s, pretty much the Brahmavidya uh, trilogy of records that sort of gave them their more syncopated, more inherently Vedic metal sound, which was their own, and was it was often compared to like the Melakesh and Absu and even like Argoslint at some point because of their sort of aggressive melodic side. But they found their own groove in their sound a while ago, and Eight Mahavidyas is a very extensive exploration of their sound and that unique unique beat by which they live. And I think that it's a daunting and like it's a lot of record to take in at once. It's over 60 minutes and the songs are quite long, but it's supposed to be a tantric experience in the sense that, and I don't, tantric doesn't mean sexual. It just means um, you're accessing those parts of yourself. And, sorry for any spiritual bullshit here, but uh, basically, it's a feeling, and it's a interesting one. It's a unique one, you know. Um, so, obviously, I didn't prepare many thoughts on this record, but it did drop later in the month. It's yeah, and it's worth checking out. It's worth knowing this band and going through their discography and seeing what you like. I've been a fan for since 2004 or five, So I really get this band already, and I was there for like their big or more popular albums. So it's cool to see that they're not only back, again after a while, but with a pretty solid showing of what they're all about. So, uh, Satanic War Master is a pretty well known Finnish black metal band who are uh, influential, and this is like a very solid record after some fairly long wait for a new one. And it shares some similarities with the True Werewolf album that he released like a year or two ago with similar session musicians. But this is classic Satanic War Master post 2003 kind of sound. It just has more keyboards, bigger melodies, big, complete, and very catchy songs that you're going to remember for weeks after you hear them. I think there's a reason this band is popular, and it's not because people find them controversial. It's because these songs are catchy, and that guitar style is still impressive, even though it's been um, emulated and borrowed so many times. So I think this is the real thing, and it's very good. I listened to this album a ton, so easy recommendation there. Um, So I was able to premiere this split. It's between Russian death metal band Gosudar and Texas death metal band Malignant Altar, and we kind of get the continuing impressive entrance of Gosudar into the world of modern old school minded death metal. Who they're fantastic at what they do. They're they're a little bit unidirectional. They're all over the place, but there's always a good riff behind wherever they're going, and their sound has some similarities to, I guess, the classic, what you would think consider the classic Finnish death metal sound, but also some various other influences from all over the place. They're just kind of surprisingly great at whenever they do anything, and the 10-minute song on here kind of sells their more uh, Death Doom side. It's not necessarily Death Doom proper, but it does go to, it shows what atmosphere they're capable of, and it's really impressive. And similar things could be said about Malignant Altar, except that they've decided to stop. Uh, they're unable to continue with what they're doing. So this is sort of their swan song, which includes like a great imprecation cover and an original song from them. And their sound is more centered around deliberate grooves that are pretty easily read, and that's kind of what's popular not only in Texas but in death metal right now. And it's a little bit more moshable. It's like a kind of nod your head kind of death metal rather than the freaking the fuck out death metal. So I enjoyed both their debuts of each of these bands back in 2021, and I was stoked that they were putting out a split with new material, and it reflects the quality of what they've done in the past on their demos and their records. So, pretty easy, just uh, nod to this one. I think it's one of the better records out in December, obviously. And Negrum is a Swedish, well, a Sweden-based death black metal band who definitely fit somewhere between like an Ultra Sylvam and a Watan in terms of a lot of the aggression and chaos they bring to their sound. But the fellow who kind of put together the band, he's got some other influences beyond just classic Swedish black metal, and that includes thrash and heavy metal. You can feel it in these songs that classic heavy metal is some of an influence in the way they're structured and performed. I think there's a lot of you definitely get the the identity of the band through his work, and I think they've really come to a pretty impressive point here in developing their sound over 10 years in various lineups and uh, moving from Mexico to Sweden to sort of make that all happen. So, really impressive record. I think it's been pretty underrated since release. I haven't seen enough people freaking out about it, but definitely worth grabbing, I think. Sacrilegion is a Utah-based melodic death metal band in the sort of early 90s notion of what melodic death metal was, which is more straightforward death metal with some technical touches, with the early Swedish sound applied. And you'll find this in early 2000s. The Chasm is a good comparison. You do hear some Chasm influenced riffs right up front on the record, but that's not all that it's about. If you're a fan of Cenotaph's second full length, I think that's a good place to sort of build what you think this sounds like, and then intestine ballism and some of the brutality of that comes through here, but most of it's uh, a little bit mid-paced, and they never really hit that like big soaring like catchy melody on the lead guitars, but the the balance is there to where it's all very memorable and heavy and just a cool record to listen to. I think it's an awesome debut, and I'm looking forward to them, you know, kicking the idea forward more and getting it out there because I don't think enough people have realized how cool this band is. So um, I haven't finished the review for Har Shaitan yet, but I've listened to it extensively. It's a German black metal band from a guy who the last time he put out a record under this name I think was 2009, a full length record. So this is um, definitely pulling back to the fundamentalist black metal side of the German black metal scene in the late 90s and early 2000s, and that's only going to make sense if you were there and then. I think that there are a lot of bands I could throw at this that would give you an idea, but you know, it's a black metal record in the most classic sense. It's contained, it's depressive, it's heavy, and it's got a really like, a perfect guitar sound for what it does. So otherwise, you know, think early 90s German black metal. Uh, not not completely obsessed with Norwegian stuff yet, especially not the mid 90s stuff. So it's a not so much a novelty, but like an exploration of like black metal feeling and ugliness that's really vital to that sound. So I thought it was exceptional. Imha Tarikat has a third full length out, and it is, you know, I would say generally just as good as the last two. And they play a very expressive form of melodic black metal, which has a theatric vocal style. Well, let's say a declarative, shouted vocal style, which a lot of people have likened to Bolzer in the past. It's not a very direct comparison, but uh, the personality of the project is pretty strong, and I think the sound is robust, and I think that the guitar work doesn't yet floor me, but the charisma of the project is really uh, notable for what it does. So I think that's a exceptional record. I don't think that they need to explore other genre additives so much as develop somewhere more memorable to go with the guitar work and the vocal cadence. I think that stepping into a little bit of a post punk beat does nothing for this type of music, and it shows a disinterest in the melodic black metal direction they should just they hardly sort of embraced on previous records. So I don't think the guitar work is quite as good as the last two, but the experience is still on par. So I enjoyed this record. Salvation is a Chicago-based noise rock slash. Let's call. I would call them like more of a garage rock band than a grunge band, but their earlier records were very influenced by grunge, and um, not to say that that was wacky bluesy rock all the time, but that the garage rock is part of what they do. I think that this is noisy, emotional, personal, aggressive, interesting in its rhythmic values, and you just don't see a lot of bands that go for the over the top flaying of the self on a record as often as you do from Salvation. So I thought this one stood out. You know, I don't like the album cover. I'll say that right. That's my biggest thing is I try to cover noise rock all the time, but you know, if I don't like your album cover, I'm just not going to cover it. I'm just a dick like that. So this is, you know, I like this enough to where I can overlook whatever that is, the pink eye, and uh, really have enjoyed this record. So that's worth checking out if you like noise rock. If you only like metal, you're not going to like this record at all. So just chill out for a second. Uh, Appalling is a death metal band from Richmond, Virginia. Let's call them a black and death metal band. I think they've they sort of finally have a handle on the quality of the work they're doing. They're pulling off actual death metal rhythms and good, intense blackened death metal rhythms. And now the black metal side of their sound is coming out more. I think it's their interest in black metal as it applies to their sound has been developed into something great on Sacrilege. And it would be easy to overlook this record if you don't really see this type of music beyond Angel Corpse and Centurion, but this is a pretty good record. I would recommend at least giving it a chance and giving it, you know, get to the middle of the album and see what they start to do with black metal on this record. I think it's pretty cool. It's not too far out of the normal range of that type of music, but it's good. Um, and Plowshare have, you know, instead of continuing to poke at outside of their comfort zone, have shattered the floor beneath themselves and landed upon a experimental dark electronic record, which is kind of electronic metal, avant black death, you know, whatever it is, it's pretty cool. And this EP has 5 original songs, and then it has sort of extreme mixes of each of those following it. And in some cases, I really wish they just didn't include the remixes because some of them are more extreme and kind of wild than the songs themselves. And then the songs are actually pretty catchy and cool. They're just kind of cool. So, solid step into the unknown, but I think they could have done without like twisting its nipples just yet. You know, make that a second EP. You know, a remix for the fans. But it is a huge paradigm shift, and I don't know how to get. You know, how can I get the average death metal fan interested in that? Think if no, you know, it's just going to be a thing that you're going to have to want to get into. It's very different. If you're into dark and experimental electronics, uh, give that band a chance. If you like, also like extreme metal, because they're doing something cool there that just needs a couple more releases. Uh, Abysmal Lord is a war metal band, a black death metal band, a bestial death metal band, however you want to parse that. I would compare most of their work up to this point to Proclamation, as in the sense that it is drowned in reverb and brutal and has a very aggressive riff oriented take on the subgenre. And this in particular uh, pulls back on that noise. It pulls back on the reverb and just gives you ugly bestial death metal. I really appreciate that about this record. I think been a little bit under noticed because it is coming out at the very end of the year on the second to last day of the year. But these are, I think it's some of their best songwriting. And I think they lost a member or they switched around the dynamic of the group. And I think it's had pretty good results in giving some clarity and some attack here. And I think this band has sort of been overlooked in the past, where I think more people, when they actually pick this up, and if you like war metal, bestial death metal, you'll appreciate what this record is doing. Um, so Ire is a pretty well respected solo project from musician Vulturius out of Portugal, and he's been at it for a couple of decades here. So This is sort of to celebrate that. And I don't know if these were just impromptu recordings or if he's leaning back into the more raw side of his sound. But you kind of see the old approach, the original influence, a lot of the gnarlier sounds, the mushier guitar tones, and the droning impromptu recordings uh, all over this record, which is raw and noisome and kind of in the tradition of Portuguese black metal as it sort of became a thing. And it's a very specific niche to try to get into, and I think it's worth this as an introduction to some of the possibilities of what this guy does. And yeah, it's fairly unique. So Barabbas, Barabbas, however you would say that. Their latest album is actually better than their last record. This is a fairly traditional uh, doom metal band, and one that kind of lands somewhere between the seriousness, the more serious side of the like late '80s traditional doom metal, and the more stony side of '90s doom metal. What does that actually mean? It means that there's a bit of Candlemass in some songs. There's a bit of Cathedral in other songs, most in each. And I found those things combined kind of has like a Paul Chain effect to me. Only certain records that you would have to know if you were a huge fan of that, artist. But I particularly like this type of sound, and I think this band has only improved over time. So this is a record worth checking out. It's kind of the one you want to grab if you want to know what this band is all about. And I was intrigued because they contributed a song to a Cathedral tribute album a couple of years ago, and I'm a huge fan of Cathedral from start to finish. So this was a cool band to pick up and now finally catch on a full length. So, and it seems like it's probably one of their best releases to date. Uh, so Green King is how it's kind of like a stoner traditional heavy metal band with where the late '70s rock influences collide with the more aggressive traditional heavy metal side. And if you've so I really like Black Wizards Live in Oblivion. I think that's a perfect example of almost exactly what this record sounds like. Also Saviors, although they're a little bit more punk in general, but it's heavy proto metal influenced stoner heavy metal rock, whatever you want to call it. It's memorable. It's very well performed, and sort of a last thing to catch before you duck out of December. And it might. I found a pretty substantial record, so I just found it a lot later than the rest of these. So interesting December. I'm kind of distracted because I'm working on the end of the year list, the big 100 top releases. So check these out in the meantime and see if you like any of them.